Our next two speakers are a good news story, so we should take heart because we have our victories in the pro-life movement, and this is one of these victories. When we invited John Sikkema and Patricia Maloney to speak at our conference, a legal decision had not yet been made in their case. And I remember when I read the court decision and heard the news that they had won their court challenge, I was delighted. So our first speaker is Patricia Maloney. Patricia is a writer, pro-life writer and a blogger. Her blog is Run With Life, and I would encourage you to visit and read her articles. So Patricia's work has been published in the Ottawa Citizen, the National Post, and the Globe and Mail. She is what I call an expert in freedom of information requests. She's done requests at the federal government level and the provincial level, and this court case has to do with the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act in Ontario concerning abortion data. So Patricia had made a request, some requests, and previously this is how she had found out what we knew, that the statistics on abortion were incomplete, and anyway, after that there was a change in the law, and she was no longer able to obtain the data on abortion that she wanted. So I will leave the microphone to Patricia. Okay. Can you hear me?
Not too well.
I'm not used to speaking in front of the microphone. How's that?
It is a bit tired.
How's that?
Better.
Good? All right. I'd like to begin by thanking Life Canada and Action Life for inviting me here today to speak to you about our Charter Challenge. Now, I don't really consider myself a public speaker. In fact, I would prefer to be anywhere today, looking out on all of you, waiting for me to say something brilliant. I'll do my best, but I'm not promising it. So why am I here? Because I really wanted to share with you why I do what I do. I think this is an important question we all ask ourselves from time to time. And I think it's important to know the answer. Why do I do what I do? For me, it is a call. And as a call, it is what I'm good at doing. I think the two usually go together. First, let me give you a quick recap of our case. I used to make Freedom of Information requests, or FOI requests, to the Ontario government to get abortion data. Then the law changed to prevent me from getting access to this abortion data. Data that is not otherwise available because it isn't reported. Next, clarification on some key terminology. There are surgical abortions, and there are medical or chemical abortions. There are also fetal reduction abortions. A fetal reduction abortion is exactly what it sounds like. The woman is carrying more than one fetus, but one of the fetuses is aborted. The agency that reports abortions is the Canadian Institute for Health Information, or CIHI. The only abortions reported by CIHI are surgical abortions. CIHI does not report on either medical or fetal reduction abortions. So you can see how and why CIHI's numbers aren't very accurate. What is far more accurate is doctors' billing records, based on the Ontario Health Insurance Plan, or OHIP. Our case was about accessing those OHIP records. Because we were successful in our Charter Challenge against the Ontario government, we now know that in 2015, 2016, doctors performed 6,489 medical abortions in Ontario. That same year, doctors performed 110 fetal reduction abortions. If we hadn't won our Charter Challenge, and John will be speaking more about that next, we still wouldn't know how many of these medical and fetal reduction abortions are taking place.
We also wouldn't have accurate numbers of abortions done in clinics and doctors' offices. What did it take to get here? It took time, it took patience, it took perseverance, it took lots of help, it took prayers from lots of people. Each of us is here today because we believe in what we do. It's not an easy job fighting for justice for preborn children. It's hard, it's complicated, it's not popular, it's frustrating, and as we learned from this morning, it's often depressing. I laugh when some pro-choice people say we don't care about women, that we lie to women. I laugh when politicians marginalize us, when they treat us like we're deplorables. I have to laugh. I like laughing. It makes me feel better, and it's far better than crying. So why do we do it? It's because we know it's the right thing to do. When I became active in the pro-life movement, almost 10 years ago, I did it kicking and screaming. I never really gave abortion much thought. I preferred to sit on the fence, looking over both sides, committing to neither. At the time, my sister Barb, who's over there, was working for the Parliamentary Pro-Life Caucus, working on Ken Epps' Unborn Victims of Crime Act. Barb spoke to me about the bill, about how it would protect a woman's child who was killed during an act of violence towards the woman. It seemed like a common sense bill. It would protect the wanted child of a pregnant woman. To someone like myself, who wasn't involved in the pro-life, pro-choice debate, I thought it odd that anyone could have a problem with such a bill. But there were people against it. This made no sense to me. I remember what abortion advocate Joyce Arthur said about Bill C-484, and I quote, "If the fetuses are recognized in this bill, it could bleed into people's consciousness and make people change their minds about abortion." End quote. Suddenly it was clear to me. There were people who opposed the bill for no other reason than it might change someone's mind about abortion. This was my introduction into the murky waters of abortion politics. And so in 2008, my pro-life career began. I found myself writing letters to newspapers about Bill C-484. The more I thought about it, the more I became engaged in the debate. Then in 2010, I started my Run with Life blog. I wasn't sure I should. I wondered if I had anything to write. I wondered if anyone would read what I had to say. But my sisters Barb and Maureen and my friend Jennifer strongly encouraged me to go ahead. I began to write. I began to research. It quickly became clear to me that data for abortions in Canada was uneven and often inaccurate. Stats Canada, who originally published abortion data, had given it up not long after the 1988 Morgenthaler decision that overturned the existing abortion law. Prior to 1988, abortions were only performed in hospitals. Now abortion facilities were springing up across Canada. It had always been mandatory for hospitals to report their abortions. Not so with clinics. And many clinics didn't report them. Stats Canada didn't want to stand behind these inaccurate numbers. This brought about the change that we have today. Kai took over the reporting of abortion. It seemed to me that having inaccurate abortion information wasn't exactly helpful, especially when you're blogging about abortion. Together with this reality, in 2010, I received a request from a doctor to find out how many abortions were actually being done in Ontario. The doctor suggested I do an FOI request to the Ontario government based on doctors' billing records. He knew OHIP records would provide more accurate data. After a couple of successful FOI requests, one was refused. That's because the Ontario government, unbeknownst to anyone, had just changed the law. And the rest, as they say, is history. What does this story teach us? For me, there are a couple of things. But first, I need to tell you about Nicky. Nicky was our Jack Russell Terrier. If any of you have ever owned a Jack Russell, you will know what these small animals are like. Nicky would take on any dog at any time. Once he nearly had his face bitten off when he stuck his head inside a crack in a neighbor's fence. The neighbor had two large dogs who took a big chunk out of Nicky's snout. Another time, Nicky was pinned to the ground by a much larger dog who was going for his throat. My kids screamed. I screamed. Somehow we got the big dog off Nicky. Nicky was unperturbed. Once free, he still wanted a piece of the other dog. One evening, I had just finished preparing dinner. I had put Fred's supper on the table. It was a dinner that included a bone-in chicken breast. I turned my back, and within a split second, Nicky had leaped up onto the dinner table with his tiny legs. He grabbed that chicken breast into his mouth. He stared at me, daring me to do something. Screaming at him was pointless. I knew he wouldn't give it up. I did the only thing I could. I grabbed my dog, I opened the back door, and threw him outside, chicken breast and all. If he wanted to eat those bones, well, that would teach him, I thought. You dumb dog. The thing is, Nicky wouldn't have lasted long in this world without other people along for the ride. To watch his back, to rein him in, to show him when he was wrong, to steer him in the right direction. I am Nicky. I decided to not let the changes to the law go, but I needed people to help me. In fact, it would have been quite impossible for me to do any of this on my own. Barb began when she goaded me into writing letters to editors about Bill C-484. She knew exactly what buttons of mine to push. Then there were those encouraging me to blog. There was the doctor who asked me to find out the FOI information in the first place. There were conversations with Alberto and Faye and others, brainstorming about how we could make a legal argument for our case. There was Alberto coming up with the freedom of expression angle. That was brilliant. There was Andre and John and Mike and all of ARPA, who helped with the legal work and more. There were all the people in this room, and some not in this room, who prayed, who encouraged, and who donated money to our case. What I had was my own chicken breast, and my own unique set of talents. I was a decent writer, I was tenacious. Once that chicken breast was in my mouth, there was no way I was going to give it up. I persevered, I reasoned, I wrote letters and called politicians. I wrote countless blog posts on our case, I followed through. As long as there was something else I could do, I did it. I never gave up. These are the things I'm good at. Every person in this room has their own unique set of talents, a call, something they do really well, and they go for it. Your call may be different from my call, but it is just as important. It may be more important. You all do what you can for mothers and their preborn children. I just happen to be a Jack Russell Terrier. Maybe you're a poodle, or a Labrador Retriever, or maybe you're a Chihuahua. Whatever your background, you have to work with the talents you have. Then you find others who know more than you do, or have a different talent than yours, or maybe is just a better public speaker than you are, and you go with it. Eventually we'll get there. Society will tell women about the other choices, about how bringing a new life into this world doesn't have to be a punishment, that it can be a joy, that it can be love, that it can be worthwhile, that is important. And you don't give up, and neither do I. Thank you.
So our next speaker is John Sikkema. John serves as ARPA's, the Association for Reform Political Action's legal counsel, and he's a member of the law and policy team here in Ottawa. In his role, John provides legal research for ARPA's board and staff. He conducts federal and provincial legal policy analysis. He assists with our court intervention in cases, and he lobbies members of Parliament, among other things. John is a lawyer who most recently served as Associate Counsel for the Christian Legal Fellowship. John's writing has appeared in the National Post, Policy Options, Comment, and the Christian Legal Journal. Please welcome John Sikkema.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Pat, I actually had a Jack Russell kid, and what I remember doing incessantly was digging. Just in we were on a country property, every rodent hole I could find, thing wouldn't stop digging. I had to clean the mud off it all the time. No analogy there or anything, but just digging. So just keep digging, I guess, but watch out for rodents. And come up for air sometimes. Thanks, Life Canada and Action Life for inviting me. It is nice to know that the invitation was a long time ago and it wasn't contingent on a victory in this case. I have the privilege of working for ARPA Canada and We Need a Law as legal counsel. Tabitha and Anna are here as well from our organization today. And we had the privilege, of course, of partnering with Pat as co-claimant in this case, and with Albertos Polizigopoulos as our counsel. And we took the Ontario government to court, and we won, and that's our story. So that's what I've been asked to talk about. Now I know I see a few people here at this conference who heard Mike Shooten and I going around talking about this case before it was heard, and my part of that kind of traveling roadshow was to explain the arguments we were going to make in court before we made them. And that did feel a little bit dry. It made me think of, I don't know if anyone here has ever heard Jerry Seinfeld talk about air travel. His little bit on the pilot who's super keen and excited to fly, and he's going to tell you, first I'm going to take it up to 10,000, and then we're going to make it left by Chicago, and he takes you through all the steps, and everyone in the back is like, yeah, just do what you got to do, I guess. I mean, just end up where it says on the ticket, really, that's the point. So, thankfully, we ended up in the right place, and I'm not going to go through too much detail about how we got there legally, but I do got to give you a bit of a recap, since that's I think why I'm up here. I'll try to keep that part short, and I'll try to reflect on why it matters, and I'll also offer a few thoughts about using the courts to advance the pro-life cause and really the limits of that. So as Pat said, before 2012, under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or FIPA, she could and did request information in the government's possession about abortion. And by the way, you can do this too on a whole number of policy issues. It's not terribly expensive or complicated, although you kind of need to know what you're asking for. And of course, there were always, and there still are, limits on what kind of information you can access. Right? So you can't access someone else's personal health information or information about a particular abortion facility. These kinds of things have been denied under safety exemptions and so on. But Pat, of course, was asking for anonymous statistical data based on OHIP billings, and she was able to get it until this abortion amendment was passed. And after that happened, the ministry rejected a request from Pat that was just like the other ones she had made, which were granted. And so Pat appealed that decision of the health ministry to not give her information to the Information and Privacy Commissioner. And the commissioner's job is to be an independent officer and to review government decisions about information, right? So health ministry might say, we don't want to give you this. The commissioner looks at it and says, is that fair? Is there a reason not to? The problem was, after that amendment, the commissioner basically had no power to help Pat out, right? Because the amendment basically says FIPA doesn't apply to abortion statistics. And FIPA is where the commissioner gets its power to review those kinds of decisions. So the commissioner is essentially saying, we can't help you. So that's when Pat, Albertos, and ARPA decided to challenge the law itself. And we ended up framing the issue this way. Basically, the issue is whether or not the government can avoid accountability on an issue of public importance by denying access to information about that issue. And of course, up until 2010, the answer to that question was yes. The government could close off the public's right of access to information because that right was statutory. That right comes from the statute FIPA. And freedom of information legislation actually didn't exist until the 1980s. And before then, we would have to rely on our elected members to do their job of holding the government to account. Right? There was no constitutional right to access data or government information without a statute giving you that kind of right. A few months, though, before Pat's case, and before actually the amendment that blocked abortion data, before that amendment, the Supreme Court of Canada expanded the charter right to freedom of expression in a very important way. Now, the ordinary meaning of freedom of expression, of course, as a constitutional freedom, is that the government cannot silence you, right? Unless it can establish that it has a demonstrably justified reason for doing so. So it can't, say, shut down your blog, for example, unless there's a blog out there that is maybe inciting people to violence or something like that. Now, of course, the government did not shut down Pat's blog. Rather, it wouldn't give her information that she wanted for the blog and, by extension, for the public. Okay? And before 2010, constitutional law did not preclude the government from doing so. But principle did. Now, in 2010, in the Criminal Lawyers Association case, the Supreme Court says that freedom of expression may require the government to disclose records in its possession where the person seeking access, in this case, Pat, can show that without access, meaningful public discussion on a matter of public importance would be substantially impeded. There's a lot of legalese, but that's the test. Right? So the court called access to government information a derivative right of freedom of expression, where access is necessary for meaningful expression on matters of public importance and where disclosure does not interfere with the proper functioning of government. Right? There's obviously things you could ask for that would cause problems for the government if they had to give it to you. So in short, stifling important debate by hiding information for no good reason violates freedom of expression, is the principle. So we just used that case. In that case, the plaintiffs actually lost. They didn't get access to information. But we used that case and that principle successfully in Pat's case. And the Ontario court agreed with us that the use of taxpayer funds for abortion is an important political issue, and that making abortion-related data inaccessible makes it impossible to meaningfully discuss how money is being spent on abortions and what the outcome of that service, which is a public service, is. And so the court further ruled that there is no good reason to not release the data. So the government argued that there were safety implications and the judge said, you have no evidence of that. Absolutely no evidence that anonymous data about the provision of abortion is going to cause some kind of security risk. The government also argued that this exclusion, saying that FIPA doesn't apply, basically gave it free rein to give information or not give information as it saw fit. And in the middle of our case, the government said, oh, here's one of the numbers you're looking for. Right? But the judge thankfully didn't buy it. He concluded that there was no longer any reliable or intelligible path to access that data, and he saw that as problematic. So the core principle of access to information legislation is that information of a public nature should be available to the public. As our Supreme Court said 20 years before it ever created this derivative right, it recognized that the overarching purpose of access to information legislation is to facilitate democracy by giving us the information we need as citizens to participate meaningfully in the democratic process and to help us ensure that politicians and bureaucrats remain accountable to us. And obviously the abortion amendment violated these core principles, and now it's scaled back. Now the abortion exclusion with the new amendment only applies to information that's specific to a doctor or a particular facility. So this is obviously a big win for government accountability. Information about publicly funded services belongs to the public. To be honest though, I have mixed feelings about that 2010 Supreme Court decision in Criminal Lawyers Association that created the derivative constitutional right to access information. Now, obviously, on the positive side, that case gave Albertos and Pat and ARPA their opening to challenge the FIPPA amendment in court just a few years later. And I'm obviously thankful that we were able to do that successfully. And we should, of course, continue to use existing legal precedent to the advantage of the pro-life cause. On the other hand, judicial discovery of derivative rights is dangerous. We think of, in the States, the Griswold case discovers a right to privacy based on the due process, the Fifth Amendment. From that right, they discover a derivative right or an implied right to abortion. So you had due process to privacy to abortion. This is kind of the track that we get on sometimes. And while this one worked out favorably for us in this case, it is concerning for that reason. When it comes to Section 7 of our charter, I do worry about what kind of derivative rights certain judges might find therein in the future. And I don't think it's going to be a derivative right or even a recognition of the basic right to life of the unborn. It'll probably go the other way. And so there's reason for caution there. On the other hand, there's also an issue of the courts setting itself up as basically the protector of government accountability. The Supreme Court's ruling lessens or seems to lessen the responsibility of elected representatives for ensuring open and accountable government. See, the executive branch of government is the branch that runs all kinds of programs, controls huge departments, and has piles and piles of information, and spends piles of money. And it's the legislature that holds it to account, as it's one of its main jobs. It's a legislature that passes laws requiring the government to report to the Legislative Assembly on a whole number of things. It's the legislature, it's our elected representatives who speak for us, who pass legislation establishing auditors and ethics commissioners and other oversight bodies and mechanisms. It's our representatives who enacted FIPPA in the first place, which allowed the public to participate in a more direct way in their work upholding the executive branch to account. And it's our elected representatives who also ask questions in the Legislative Assembly, or are supposed to, and who use legislative committees to investigate important issues. I mentioned earlier that access to information laws were introduced in Canada around the time of the Charter in the 1980s. And at that time, there was actually discussion about making access to information a constitutional right. But it was decided, I think rightly, that access is better governed by the legislative branch, by legislation. Not because it isn't fundamentally important, obviously it is, but because it's complex, for one thing. FIPPA is a lot longer than the Charter. And because it's something the legislative branch is ostensibly committed to protecting. Right, so it's judged wiser to leave it to the legislature to adopt this complex piece of legislation as necessary. And it's taken for granted that MPs, MLAs, desire accountable government. Now, the abortion amendment was, as I said, a crude violation of the core principles of this good system. Never before had one policy issue been singled out like that in our Freedom of Information statute for exclusion. And that law deserved to be defeated. Given how obvious it is a breach of those principles, though, and the importance of freedom of information legislation as recognized by everyone, it's saddening to me that it took a court case to do it. Now, after we won our case, our Director of Law and Policy, Andre Schutten, was on CBC Radio with a representative of Planned Parenthood. And they were both in full agreement that the outcome of our case was right. They were in agreement that the law was a bad law, yet nobody in the legislature would touch it. No one suggested repealing it. This was after it was brought to people's attention. See, the invention of a derivative charter right to access information amounts to the judiciary setting itself up as the guarantors of government accountability, something seemingly heroic that judges may like to do. But the danger then is that the mindset of legislators and people changes from believing that we have a duty to demand open and accountable government, we have a duty to debate and investigate the issues, to figuring that, well, the judicial branch will guard against censorship and secrecy. Right? The judicial branch will take care of the hard issues. A famous American judge from the 20th century, Judge Learned Hand, his real name, said that liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. And when it dies there, no constitution, no court can save it. While it lies there, it needs no constitution and no court to save it. Jeremy Waldron, one of the world's most prominent legal philosophers today, observes the difference between political debate in the United States and the United Kingdom on abortion and other issues. Americans, Waldron comments, congratulate themselves on consigning issues like abortion to the courts, on the grounds that courts may be regarded as forums of principle. But in Waldron's view, the key difference between British and European legislative debate and the American judicial reasoning that has kind of spilled over into Canada through our Charter of Rights is that the latter, judicial reasoning, is concerned with legal interpretation and legal doctrine, while thoughtful legislative debate, in several examples, people are able to focus steadfastly on the issue of abortion itself and what it entails, on the ethical status of the unborn child, on the predicament of pregnant women, and on the moral difficulties that all of this involves. And those are issues, says Waldron, that surely need to be debated when a society is deciding on abortion. And those are the issues that are given the most time in meaningful legislative debate and the least time in judicial deliberations. Consequently, constitutionally entrenched rights and a prominent role for courts in deciding these kinds of issues tends to drive out questions of justice and right from the minds of legislators and even the public, and to fill our minds with thoughts of mere legality or constitutionality. It can also make us lazy, even when it comes to analyzing issues of legality, simply because we, or especially elected representatives, believe that the courts will correct them if they get it wrong. Right? This phenomenon has actually been called democratic debilitation by political scientists. So you might think that a ruling like the Criminal Lawyers Association, creating a derivative right to access information connected to the Charter of all things, would give governments pause. It would make them think more carefully about freedom of expression and accountability. Well, it hasn't. It didn't give the Ontario government pause for this law or the bubble zone law. And it didn't inspire the opposition to do anything about it either. Right? And the government knows this. So fast forward a little bit. In the summer of 2017, we have Pat and ARPA's victory written out and explained by a judge. We also have, in the middle of this year, a case called Bratton versus Fort Erie, in which the Ontario Court of Appeal throws out a trespass notice issued by the town of Fort Erie against a man for protesting outside of City Hall because it violated his freedom of expression. Right? Some people were intimidated by him. He was a large man. He was kind of loud. They threw it out and they said, "This is ridiculous. There's no justification for giving this man a trespass notice when he's on public property." So Pat's case and Bratton's case, both out of Ontario, both this year, both just before the bubble zone bill, offered opposition MPPs in Ontario some pretty easy talking points, or hey, forget talking points, questions, some basic questions about this bill. Ontario's new law creating censorship zones around abortion providers, but none of them used it. In fact, right off the bat, the opposition leader moved to fast-track the government's bill without debate. Right now, I'm not trying to get you riled up against Patrick Brown, that's a little too easy. I'm trying to get us to think about the brokenness of the legislative branch in this province and the need to strengthen it. And to think about the failure of MPPs to understand or to live out their basic duties. And I think we need to build relationships with them. I don't want anyone to go dump all over whoever didn't show up for the vote. But we need to build relationships with them and hold them to this and explain this to them and ask them what their idea of their duties are. Our Parliament's official website, ourcommons.ca, says some pretty basic civics grade 10 kind of stuff about how Parliament works. It says public debate on proposed legislation is essential to Parliament. Our parliamentary system remains democratic in part because the representatives are elected by the people and because opposition members are free to express their views on policies of the government. Right? Think about that in light of no one saying anything except cheerleading some of the government's recent bills. And it also says this: opposition parties work to ensure that legislation is carefully examined and that different views and opinions on important initiatives are publicly expressed and defended. John Diefenbaker, our 13th Prime Minister, said this: if Parliament is to be preserved as a living institution, the opposition must fearlessly perform its functions. When it properly discharges them, the preservation of freedom is assured. This is before we had the charter, right? The reading of history proves that freedom always dies when criticism ends. So, the opposition finds fault. It suggests amendments. It asks questions and elicits information. It arouses, educates, and molds public opinion by voice and by vote. So what happens when pro-life or even pro-free expression politicians do not speak up or show up to a vote is that it confirms in the minds of the media and the public that this really isn't an issue that they take seriously, that they really only take political gamesmanship seriously, that they have accepted that their, or at least their supporters' views do not belong in the public square and will not be given voice. They are willing to be silent when our province is passing a law that would jail a person for quietly handing someone a business card with the name and number of a pregnancy care center on it, if you're somewhere near an abortion facility. Imagine going to jail for that. What country are we living in? Or even for trying to persuade a pharmacy to stop providing abortion pills, say by sending emails to someone you know who works there. Right? So we have people willing to miss a vote or vote cheerlead for this legislation, even when they claim to be pro-freedom of expression. Or to miss a vote when voting is at the very core of their responsibility. So we should all of us remember that we will have to give an account for every idle word, as Jesus said, but also, as St. Ambrose thought it was fair to add to that, also for every idle silence. So I am grateful for the victory in this case, but the future of the pro-life movement is not in the courts, or at least not primarily. Pro-life lawyers, or even lawyers hired by pro-lifers who do their job well, might be able to help preserve access to information and freedom of expression. But the FIPPA case took years. A legal challenge to the bubble zone law will take time and money as well. The government knows this. It is not through the judicial branch that we will sustain, or more so advance, this cause, right? The government can create problems faster than we can fight them in court, and it knows this. Particularly when opposition leaders try to speed up legislation rather than scrutinize it. So I think the most important question is not how much freedom can we say recover from this bubble zone law? Can we get it scaled back? Maybe we can. The most important question is what will we do with the freedom that we have? And I really appreciated John Carpe's talk on that. I'd also mention ARPA. We had a fall tour recently where we gave people tips basically for building a relationship with elected representatives. It's called the 12-month action plan, and it just sends people an email. If you're not signed up for that, you might want to. It gives people an email saying, here's some ideas this month for connecting and building a relationship with your elected representative, right? In a respectful way, starting by maybe sending them an email, a Christmas card, showing up at an event in the riding where they might be, little things like that, right? It can't just be an email like John Carpe said and then we're done. So how carefully and wisely will we exercise our freedom of expression? And we may need to confront not only our opponents, but also those on our side who fail to exercise their freedom or who exercise it foolishly, right? We need to work together. And so I leave it with John Carpe's practical tips. I hope I haven't set too negative a tone with some of the reflections on kind of the limited role of the courts here. In terms of being more hopeful, I'm really looking forward to Jonathan and Marin's talk. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.